Hello, and welcome to our Year Ahead 2024 podcast on geopolitics and its intersection with markets and economics. I'm your host, John Briggs, Global Head of Economics and Market Strategy for NatWest. I'm joined by two guests today. First is Brian Daingerfield, our co-head of G10 FX Strategy, who also focuses on energy and U.S. politics for us, and Scott Livingstone. For those who have not listened to our prior podcasts and webinars on geopolitics, Scott Livingstone is the international advisor to NatWest Group. Scott joined the bank after 24 years of service as a frontline diplomat in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, mostly in South Asia. Prior to that, he served as a Royal Marine officer for a dozen years, and his service has been shaped by global security issues, especially post 9/11, including terrorism, cyber, and hostile state actions. Scott and Brian, thank you very much for joining me today.
Good to be here, John.
We're going to start off, Scott, with you and on Israel. Unfortunately, in this world, there is no shortage of places to start, but let's start there with the most recent conflict, that of the war between Israel and Hamas. From a grand scheme of things, and as we look ahead to 2024, as much as we can, given the conflict is still new and evolving, how do you see this as evolving as a base case, and what's your biggest risk to the base case?
So I think we're seeing a base case emerge here, which is an operation by Israeli forces to effectively recover some hostages, as many as they can, to destroy Hamas as they have stated they will, and then to secure the Gaza Strip in a way that restores deterrence and secures Israel's border in the future. Now, that's the base case, I think, at the moment. But it's incredibly fragile, and it's fragile because there are other actors, and I see sort of three areas of potential escalation. The first is on the periphery, on Israel's other borders. We're already seeing the reports of shelling from Hezbollah and counter-shelling and counterattacks, so that there is activity on that northern border. We're reading of troublesome violence in the West Bank, and again being met with violence from Israeli defense forces. And then we're seeing, most worrying, I think, we've at least two instances of long-range missiles fired by Houthi fighters in Yemen, destined for Israel, that have been intercepted en route. Now, that is alarming in terms of the capability that that's showing, and it's alarming because of the vulnerability or the potential for accidents in that type of space. Those are the peripheral escalations. I think the much more serious escalation, which we might want to talk further on, is if we head into a fully fledged state war in the region. And here, my view is that virtually none of the state neighbors to Israel want to see a war. I was in the Gulf recently, and the strong view I got from colleagues there and contacts in that area is that it's not in the interest of the Emirates or Saudi Arabia, the Kingdom, or the GCC to see a war in the region. And I think that extends also to countries such as Egypt. None of them want to see a war, but circumstances might drag countries into a war. Misjudgments, politics, or accidents could happen. And as we see the American force build up in the region, then again we're into a space where accidents and misjudgments can happen that can accelerate that space. But the key state protagonist in that area would be Iran, and the conflict people are afraid of is a conflict with Iran. But again, here, my view and the contacts I've spoken to suggest that even Iran doesn't see this as the moment for a full throttle conflict with Israel and Israel's allies. So there are constraining forces limiting this option, but nevertheless, that escalation is potential and truly horrific. And then thirdly, John, finally, the other area of escalation I think we need to bear in mind, and this is something which I fear is almost inevitable, and that's the escalation on a global scale in terms of inspiring other actors to either come in behind the cause of the Palestinians and to avenge what they're seeing on their TV screens or on their computer screens in terms of brutality against the Palestinians. So we could see acts of terrorism on a global scale, or certainly a global reach, and we could see other actors seeing this as an opportune moment to pursue their own conflicts. And here I'm thinking of places such as Myanmar, Yemen, Sudan, even Kashmir. So I think that third era of escalation, I have to say, I think is almost inevitable. We've seen very high-level statements from Western governments concerned about radicalization in their own communities. It's certainly an issue in Europe. It's risen. The head of the FBI very recently stated that there were significant concerns about the effect on radicalization within the states. So I think this more generic sort of radicalization or inspiration from the conflict in Gaza is something we're going to have to track.
So it seems like that we continue to point to in many ways, and this geopolitical podcast is just a reminder of another way that we continue to head in towards a more volatile world. And, whether that's market volatility, inflation volatility, central bank volatility, we've gone through it the past few years. But the world geopolitically just continues to become, I think, increasingly volatile. And I worry along with you that even away from the stuff we're paying attention to, like you said, in that third risk, the unknown unknowns are going to come at us or unexpectedly throughout the process of heading through 24. I do want to follow up quickly, though, on, as you mentioned, the big one people are worried about is the Iran scenario. If we do see increased tensions, doesn't necessarily have to be outright conflict, but increased tensions where the markets and others start to worry about more open conflict. How do you see that risk playing out?
The two most likely ones would be and we've seen these behaviours before. There would be something about proxy committed violence, probably from Yemen, and if that again points towards the kingdom or points towards the Emirates, then we've got a fairly rapid drop of confidence, lifting of travel restrictions, for example. And we saw it before. We saw a drone strike very close to key facilities, key infrastructure in both Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. And if that were to happen again, then the impact would be dramatic and pretty much unstoppable in terms of certainly business confidence in the region. And then the second area, again, we've seen it before, would be some kind of confrontation or increased tension to do with shipping in the Gulf. Before this Gaza event, we saw increased tension between Iran and US forces who were aiming to protect commercial shipping. I think we will see a return to that tension, and events can just often, can surprise us in terms of ships being seized or interrupted, or forces coming too close to each other, and people misjudging the red lines of sort of safety, and so we can see an escalation in very short order. So I think it's those two areas, and the most likely some kind of drone or missile event coming in from the Houthis in Yemen, and some kind of interdiction or confrontation around shipping in the Gulf.
All right, Brian, I want to pull you into this now and thinking about the energy side of things, oil side of things. As of now, markets have been relatively contained, but probably fair given the production facilities, production regions haven't been directly impacted. And how do you feel about the energy markets and oil markets related to all this heading into 24?
Hey, John, thanks for having me. So I think, as you mentioned, oil markets have been, I'd say, relatively contained. And I think the reaction there is, as Scott, I think, nicely laid out, that the worst case scenario, at least so far, appears to have been avoided. And that appears to maybe be, at least for now, mitigating the sort of worst case scenario risks when it comes to broad reduction in oil supplies. You also made a good point, John, which is that the direct impacts to oil production facilities from the conflict have been relatively low. And so instead, we're looking at indirect impacts. And as always, oil markets are trying to judge two competing factors against each other when it comes to supply disruptions. That when you have a disruption in oil supplies, really for any reason that leads to higher prices, that in turn could act to lower demand for oil down the road. And, I think we are heading into a slower growth environment, one where consumer demand globally has held in better than I think most had expected. in 2023. I think the risks to the consumer globally, the risks to the outlook globally lean in the downside direction as we head into 2024. And so you have these risks. The market is trying to handicap these against each other, that higher supplies because of conflict is something that's not necessarily a good macro driver and something that could reduce demand down the road. And so as always, oil markets are trying to balance these factors. When it comes to the indirect supply-related issues around the sort of Israel-Hamas conflict, there's two countries that really come to mind, to front of mind, and that would be Saudi Arabia and Iran. Starting with Saudi Arabia, it's important to note that in the lead up to this conflict, there was some pretty positive mood music about the U.S. working with Saudi Arabia to normalize relations between the two countries, between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Obviously, that'd be a pretty significant move, a sort of move in the direction of stability in the region from Israel's statehood perspective. But that's the kind of normalization in relationships that feels like it's been put on pause by this conflict. And certainly that's, as we come into this conflict, that's one to watch here is the Saudi-U.S. relationship in the context of how Saudi Arabia and Israel were reportedly trying to head towards at least the semblance of an agreement towards normalization of relations. From a specific oil production standpoint, Saudi Arabia's strategy has been undershooting its commitments to reduce oil production. So for context, Saudi Arabia is looking ahead to a future where demand is more in question and has been reducing supplies of oil by more than its pledged amounts within OPEC to try and preempt that slowdown. So Saudi Arabia is producing at around 9 million barrels per day. The global benchmark is around 100 million barrels per day of supply and demand. So the math is pretty easy here. They're about 9% of global supply. That's down from 11 million barrels per day earlier in 2023. So they've been pretty aggressive in terms of reducing oil supplies to try and sort of preempt this slowdown in demand. And so I think there's ultimately the question of if there was a disruption to oil supplies that were to come from wider conflict, how would Saudi Arabia respond? We have under a previous administration in a different era when the Trump administration reapplied sanctions to Iran, sort of changing the Iran nuclear deal, Saudi Arabia stepped up and increased oil supplies in anticipation of potential shortfalls in supplies that could come from that decision. But that was under a very different administration and a very different relationship between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. I think it's fair to say that under Biden, relative to Trump, relations between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia are a bit more distant. And Saudi Arabia's role, their willingness to sort of step up and change its policies to respond in the event of a wider disruption to oil supplies is something that shouldn't be quickly assumed. The other one, as you mentioned, is Iran, John. And I think it's interesting that oil supplies in Iran, production in Iran, has actually been rising this year. So coming into the year, they were producing around 2.5 million barrels per day. Now they're producing closer to 3 million barrels per day. And that increase has happened with I think it's fair to call it U.S. maybe strategic ambivalence, if you will, towards Iran oil production, basically saying, look, we have an environment where oil prices are high. We need alternate sources of oil supply. And we're also trying to cut off Russia from Western oil supplies. And we're also trying to cut off Russia from China and India, two big buyers of global energy and two big buyers, we assume, of course, of Russian energy. And so maybe there's a bit of the enemy of my enemy is my friend going on here with the U.S., where you think about they're trying to ease up sanctions potentially on Venezuela. They're trying to allow maybe a bit more leniency in Iran production. These are two nations where India and China could source oil from and maybe put a little bit more pressure on Russia. And so there's a lot of balancing acts going on right now, but Iranian oil production has gone up. And the Biden administration was already facing some criticism over this policy from the Republican Party. That has obviously skyrocketed in the event of, in light of what's happened in Israel and in Palestine. So that's another one to watch pretty closely. Oil production has gone up, but is the U.S. going to be under a bit more pressure to try and be a lot more strict in enforcement of sanctions to try and limit oil production from Iran?
Thanks, Brian. I think that's an interesting point with Saudi Arabia now already, reducing 9%. I'm going to switch gears a little bit, go around the world. unfortunately, back to Ukraine. Now, Scott, you mentioned you were in the Gulf. I know you were in Poland before that. So it's amazing that sometimes it feels like such a conflict has now moved into the background. But I am cognizant that we're back to the cycle of winter arriving. And I just thought that on the back of you being in Poland, meeting with fellow experts on this, is there going to be an evolution to this conflict? Or are we still going to be in this state, months from now?
So, John, I was in Poland before the Gaza crisis erupted, and the mood then was of anxiety that the conflict in Ukraine had faded to the background in Western leaders' minds, and not just from their minds, but also from their industrial capacity. There was a real anxiety about the ability to dial up the production of munitions. That needed to support the campaign or to sustain the campaign. Those anxieties, I suspect, will only have deepened to folk in Ukraine or in Eastern Europe. I think not just because of the events in Gaza, but because of the events in the Senate and in Congress and in Washington in terms of the shenanigans around electing a speaker and then electing a speaker who is avowedly against or opposed to sustaining high levels of support for Ukraine. So I think there will be anxieties about sustainability. The other anxiety I detected there was to do with political solidarity in Europe. Now, things have moved on since I had those conversations. We've had an election in Poland where a pro-European coalition government is currently being formed, will probably be formed, and will take a more cooperative approach, really, in terms of European support for Ukraine, and we will see other elections coming up in Europe that will test that solidarity. But at the moment, the political solidarity appears to be fairly solid in Europe. In terms of the fighting, I agree with you. I think we're looking at a prolonged period of stalemate and attrition. Certainly on the land campaign, there is offensive actions on either side. The reporting is Russians are taking incredibly high numbers of casualties, but can backfill those fighters with their rudimentary and the weaponry that they require. So there's a sense of stagnant battlefield, and certainly going into winter, that's probably going to persist. It's worth mentioning the maritime campaign, because that is something that has shifted in the last sort of 2 or 3 months to the Ukrainians' advantage in terms of forcing the Russian Black Sea Fleet to shift their anchorage out of range, because they were being effectively struck by long range munitions. Looking ahead, John, I think this is going to go into a spring. If we talk again in 6 months' time, we'll be talking about spring offensives. We'll be talking about upgrades probably to Ukraine systems, longer range missiles, possibly fast jets, F-16s. We're hearing that F-16 training is continuing, so we may see that capability arrive. I think there will be a solution to the funding problem. It will be ugly, and it may not be perfect in terms of what President Zelensky is after, but I think it will be wrangled out of Washington, so there will be funding. And then I think the other thing we'll see is I'm reasonably confident we will see NATO expansion conclude. So at the moment it's being ratified or considered by the Turkish Parliament. Possibly at the time of broadcast that will have concluded, but I think we may see Sweden join NATO. Certainly there are some confident noises going around NATO. So in summary, a long winter. I think if you're in Ukraine, I'm afraid to say the chances are the Russians will continue to attack infrastructure with a goal of demoralizing civilian population and putting political pressure on Zelensky. And on the battlefield, it will remain fairly static with a view to increased capability fight next year. Final thing on Ukraine, and it lashes many of these points together, John, is the in terms of Western support, Western alliance. Then the big diary date next year is the July NATO conference in Washington. the June or July NATO conference in Washington. And of course, that lands slap bang in the middle of sort of peak election season in the US election, which I know that we'll talk about. But it will be a fulcrum for, or will be a target date for the momentum of the campaign to be in a positive direction by the summer of next year, as NATO convenes with new members in the middle of an election in the States. The marching orders for Ukrainian forces will be to have forward momentum by the summer of next year.
And one last one quickly. I mean, it feels like there's a sense that, okay, well, if this would have escalated beyond what it is now, we probably would have seen it. Do you agree with that? I mean, obviously there's been a couple like little things with Poland border and other stuff. I don't want to say little, but there's been some issues with Poland border and small things. But do you feel like the risk of escalation as we head into 24 is low?
I think it's the same as it's been. My view has been that it's been in very few people's interest to, nor in Putin's nor in NATO's interest, to see a broad NATO-Russia front line opened up. Most actors' view is it's in their interest to see this geographically contained, and in terms of levels of weaponry to be calibrated and contained. Now we are going to see capability incrementally increase next year, I believe, but the overall sense of keeping this geographically boxed in is in most people's interest. Until it isn't, John, and that's, I've always said, the problem with escalation, it will be in a crisis moment. It will be if Russian forces, or if Putin perceives that Russian forces are facing a catastrophic collapse. Then my judgment is there would be a risk then of escalation. It would be extremely difficult to foresee, and I could only imagine that there will be attempts from the West to use fairly hard-nosed deterrence, posturing and messaging to mitigate that risk. So I don't think the risk of escalation has changed. I think it's always been in business as usual, fairly managed and low, but we cannot write off the idea that with backs against the wall, facing a catastrophic defeat of some kind, then we could see a dramatic escalation.
Interesting. Okay. Brian, Scott mentioned before about the funding and the aid packages, and it's just a reminder that in both conflicts, a lot of this resides on U.S. domestic politics. By the time this podcast is released, we may know if further near-term aid packages for either Israel or Ukraine have been passed. But I don't think this is the last time we're going to see this discussion. And we're heading into an election year. So how are you thinking about support for these allies heading forward, given what's going on in Congress now and into an election year?
So I think what's happening in Congress right now is really a microcosm of what we're going to see in an election year, especially, which is Democrats hoping to continue to provide aid to Ukraine, and Republicans a bit more cautious on providing the level of aid that they have, that Democrats have been requesting. It's pretty clear that among Republicans, support for providing additional aid for Ukraine has gone down among the Republican base. And that's being reflected in the way that Republican lawmakers are increasingly skeptical of maybe almost like the return on investment in terms of additional aid. And it's also, you can't ignore what's happening in markets right now with very high deficits, very high inflation. The Republican Party, those who are already skeptical of additional spending wherever that spending happens to go, are even more attuned to that. And certainly the new Speaker of the House on the Republican side, also very much in that camp of on the quite conservative side. So I think what we're seeing now is Democrats trying to loop in Republican priorities, in this case, funding for Israel, which is something that's very popular, with funding for Ukraine, which for Republicans is becoming increasingly less popular. And, politics sometimes is about compromise, right? I think we're not used to, at the end of the day, that's the only way that anything really gets done in split Congress, where Democrats control the presidency and the Senate and Republicans control the House of Representatives. And so, it feels like we're heading for an environment where it's going to be increasingly pulling teeth to get anything done, let alone important strategic priorities where one party is very all in on that support, in this case, in terms of Ukraine, while the other party is a bit more suspect on the level of support being given. So I think that we're heading towards an environment where it's going to be increasingly difficult to get not only additional aid, but pretty much anything done. Congress, I think, is probably heading towards a point where we effectively shut down ahead of the campaign season for 2024 elections. Basically, at the moment, the only time anything real substantive gets done is when we set these almost artificial deadlines for ourselves, right? When we're working towards a government, if something doesn't get done, the government shuts down. If something doesn't get done, the debt ceiling lapses and there's a potential larger crisis, right? Congress loves working to deadlines, and the only time anything really substantive gets done in these split government scenarios seems to be when we have these artificial deadlines hanging over our heads. We're coming up on one as we're recording. By the time you hear this, we may know the status of the funding of the government, whether or not there's a government shutdown looming on the immediate horizon. But the debt ceiling has been resolved all the way through the election in 2024. So these artificial deadlines are coming potentially fewer and further between. So there aren't really necessarily the opportunities or the necessary deadlines that Congress loves to set for themselves in order to actually get stuff done. So feels like it's going to be increasingly pulling teeth. Democrats obviously are still quite open to putting up a united front, not just from a political signaling perspective, but also from a dollars and cents perspective. Republicans a bit more cautious on that.
So, Scott, if the U.S. at some point does not pass support for either Ukraine, how will that be taken internationally, both by our allies and our adversaries?
Well, the adversaries are already worried. It will deepen their worries. Their worry is that the colleagues in America get distracted by domestic politicking and obviously culminating in the election and possibly a shift in president and shift in policy, therefore, and particularly to do with foreign policy. So it will. For allies, it will cause anxieties, and my worry is that for adversaries, it will certainly trigger a consideration of opportunistic attacks. I fear, and I think it is one of my fears for 24, that we see this view of America distracted, possibly overstretched, possibly shifting its foreign policy to a more introspective or isolationist stance. And there will be actors around the world who will see this as a moment to take advantage of. And I think that's something that will feature through 24, particularly as I believe the Gaza campaign, even if the first and the second or the third phase of what we're seeing at the moment, it reaches some form of culmination in early 24, there's no doubt that any efforts to a strategic solution in the Middle East will consume a lot of Washington's heavy lift capability. So there's no getting away from it. America will be stretched next year in terms of foreign policy, and combined with this turbulence in the domestic front, will lead some to see this as an opportunity.
So, Brian, in longer term, the elections loom. What do you think about the potential outcomes when it comes to geopolitics in the international sphere? A similar approach, or what will be different depending on who wins, or will be the same no matter who wins?
So I think it's right that geopolitics probably takes a bit of a back seat when it comes to the election cycle, that domestic issues, the economy, inflation, social issues are probably ones that are more front in mind for voters. And I'll borrow what you said, Scott, that the U.S. is distracted almost by what's going on in domestic politics and less focused on international developments. You mentioned what are sources of difference, what are sources of similarity. I should start by saying that with former President Trump so far ahead in primary polling, it looks likely that, unless something dramatic were to change, that he is the clear frontrunner for the Republican nomination for president, and President Biden is, sitting presidents do not lose renomination contests. And so we're looking at a rematch of 2020 in 2024. to an extent that both of these men have been president before, from a geopolitics side, they're a bit of a known entity where we know Trump's America First doctrine pretty well, where there's a desire to refocus international politics on a "what have you done for me lately" style of interpretation, where President Trump is always looking at what's the benefit for America from our relationship, and looking for something a lot more tangible. Where the current president under President Biden is seeing maybe a larger, more holistic picture that there aren't specific dollar and cents benefits that come with global coordination, but there are wider benefits from having strong relationships with our traditional allies to combat our traditional adversaries. So I think the way that geopolitics intersects with the U.S. election is the way it feeds through into these domestic issues. So one of the most obvious ones is for fuel prices and oil, and we already touched on how geopolitics obviously has a very integral place in the outlook for energy markets. And from the 2024 election, that has significant implications for gasoline prices. And President Biden has already taken significant action during his time as president to try and reduce that impact for everyday Americans. And the big one has been running down the strategic reserve. So the strategic reserve has been already run down quite significantly. Oil inventories are already at fairly low levels, even accounting for that. And so if you have an environment where gasoline prices are going to be quite significant in terms of voters' opinions on Biden administration, their economic policies generally, how they're feeling about inflation, how they're feeling about the direction of the country, how they're feeling about their own pockets, let alone what's happening in the rest of the world. One place where I think it's clear that the overarching policy is probably going to be the same is the U.S. relationship with China. I think the differences between the Trump presidency and a Biden presidency on the China front has really been more stylistic and less substantive, where under sort of the Biden policy, the strategic conflict with China has been a bit more nuanced, I would say. Under Trump, it's been a bit more blunt, where you have the risk of global tariffs, for example, the risk of a change in policy based on social media was a lot more apparent under Trump than it is under Biden currently. But there's very few things in American politics that are truly bipartisan. And one of them is that China is a strategic competitor and that the U.S. needs to be angling policy in that direction. And so right now, as I mentioned, it's been a bit more nuanced, maybe a bit less front in mind for markets. But in terms of friendshoring, changing the relationship between the U.S. and China, differences in supply chains, specifically when it comes to tech and semiconductors, ESG, the batteries and all sorts of critical industries of the future, right? U.S. and China still have strategic competition in those industries. That's been continuing, although it hasn't been, I would say, an issue that's been front of mind for investors. And so I don't think that the relationship with China necessarily changes significantly under a hypothetical Biden administration starting in 2025 or a return of a Trump administration. But the way that we have to consider the risks of escalation probably do have to change, where under President Trump, I think would be fair to say there'd be risk of more sudden escalation, whereas under Biden, it would be more of a slow burn, but still in that same direction of no meaningful thawing of relations between the two nations.
Thanks for switching over to China there at the end, because Scott, you've phrased this as like a new U.S.-China Cold War, but in a different way than Cold Wars of the past, so to speak. Can you briefly describe that concept? There's massive interdependencies. So how do we deal with that?
Yeah, well, I'll do that. I'll do that, John, and also build on a couple of comments from Brian, which I do agree with. And I just want to raise the point that that difference in style, the policy may well be in the same space, but there's a difference in style. I think we'll see that difference in style quite evident if and when the long-awaited meeting between Xi and Biden takes place in San Francisco in a few weeks' time. I think I suspect President Biden will handle that in a different way than possibly President Trump would have done, and we'll see the outcome of that. But nevertheless, the underpinning policy postures are pretty consistent. I also think that those nuances have been present this summer, as in my opinion, American diplomacy has tried to get their approach back on the rails after the balloon gate incident of February of the beginning of this year. And to my mind, it is back on the rails, even in the military domain, where we're seeing signs from China there's a willingness to talk on military channels, and that has just been absent for some time. In terms of is it a new Cold War? Then my answer to that is, well, yes and no. And I also worry that that use of that terminology can mislead people. And for one of the reasons you've already said, which is unlike the last Cold War, the Cold War of last century, we've got incredible interdependencies with China. And to be honest with you, I don't think the idea of supply chains does it justice. We really are talking about the interdependencies of supply ecosystems. And that's why friendshoring is tough going, because even if you build your factory in India or Vietnam, you're almost certainly using components that are manufactured in China. Now, my view on this is that for many industries, it doesn't really change anything. But for some industries, and Brian has sort of has tipped at them, some very strategic technologies, then in my view we will see decoupling or something that looks like decoupling. But everywhere else, I think we will see some de-risking, as they call it, or some offshoring or friendshoring. But in these areas of computer power, of space technologies, of some energy transition technologies, we will see quite a ruthless competition for dominance in those technological spaces, and that ruthless competition will bring with it quite a rigid decoupling. So that one difference is that interdependency. The other difference I highlight is that in the Cold War of last century, we did have a non-aligned movement, but frankly, the power of those non-aligned countries didn't really shift the dynamics of the overall bloc politics. This time around, as we do find ourselves on diverging tracks with China, we will see much more powerful multi-aligned countries. And here I am thinking about India or Saudi Arabia or Turkey even, and those countries will matter, and we will wake up in the morning to headlines where they are making diplomatic moves or policy moves towards China or one day and towards the West and the States the next day. So I think we've just got to accept that agility or ambiguity. I think another difference is last century, the Cold War, the ideological Cold War, was the biggest risk that all of the players were facing. It was seen as the most important issue that the whole of government should be applied to defeating. This time around, in these tensions with China, we're doing so in the backdrop of our truly global risk, which is the climate. So there is another dimension this time around that we've yet to see how it will be played out. John Kerry has travelled to Beijing and has sustained a conversation on climate issues with China, and we could see this. We could see the climate crisis as an issue that actually bridges the two sort of superpower interests, or we could see it as an area of competition, or we could see it neglected as more front of mind issues take over policy leaders' sort of attentions. So I think we've yet to see where that one goes, but it is a difference from the Cold War of last century.
And I think just finishing on that last point about climate, I have a feeling, and going back to what Brian said before, the election could determine a lot when it comes to the approach on that or the prioritization. You make a good overall point, if I can too simplistically sum it up, which is this isn't just an evolution to a bipolar world. The interactions between different regions and different countries on different subjects is going to move probably quickly, and depending on what that topic is, whether it's oil with Saudi Arabia or cooperation on other issues. So it's a good reminder that this is going to be a very intricate evolution of competition, let's just say. Well, Brian, given all of that, so if in 24 we think no matter who wins the election, we're probably heading towards a different environment. Obviously, stylistic differences means that under a Twitter diplomacy environment. We have to be ready for announcements that could come at any time. But more broadly, just for 24 itself, how do you think about the U.S.-China relations as Scott laid out when it comes to markets, businesses, supply chains, the currency?
Well, I think that because we're going to be heading into campaign mode, and there's probably no campaign slogan winner better than being tough on China, I think it's pretty clear we're going to be heading into a higher period of headline risk, at least related to the U.S. relationship with China. Former President Trump has already been floating a 10% global tariff, a flat global tariff on all goods from all countries. And President Trump's sort of a unique political figure where at some points you really have to take him fully at his word, and in other times that there's a bit of a hyperbole going on here. But that's the kind of headline risk, especially in the current inflation environment that we're in, is one that we have to be mindful of as we head onto the campaign trail with President Trump former President Trump, I should say, trying to actively out-hawk current President Biden and vice versa on China. So that headline risk probably increases. But when it comes to markets, I think it's the broader picture for China is one of what is the role of fiscal stimulus and the current slowdown in activity in China, and what does that mean for the broader global outlook? So just for context, when China reopened from COVID, I think much earlier than most expected at the end of last year, the early period, early 2023, growth expectations were revised up pretty significantly in a lot of cases, and a lot of the economic data were much stronger than expected to reflect that reopening. But that reopening reacceleration really fizzled out a lot sooner than it did in most advanced economies, where we were all reopening at the same time. Fiscal stimulus was very significant, and honestly, we're still dealing with the after effects of those reopenings from a monetary policy and fiscal policy perspective. The outlook, the economic data in China have slowed, and authorities there are trying to manage a very close balancing act between supporting near-term growth while also not exacerbating long-term imbalances, particularly with their property market. And so I think the bigger question, maybe the biggest question from the China outlook as regards the global outlook in 2024 is, should we expect counter-cyclical stimulus from China to allow China to be, a growth engine for the world in 2024? You think about where are marginal sources of upside risk to the global growth outlook. Fiscal policy, in a lot of cases, we're still coming off of the extremes in Western economies from fiscal policy perspective. Monetary policy, a lot of policymakers are at the moment still cautious on providing monetary accommodation. We think that's something that might change over the course of 2024. But China is really an economy where inflation is low, growth has slowed, and there appears to be some room for major fiscal stimulus if China were to want to go down that road. So that's probably the biggest question is China going to be the marginal buyer of commodities, for example, and something that keeps the global economy supported during a time where major economies are going through a transition towards slower growth, and in some cases, we think towards recession. And our expectation is that we're going to continue to see tactical stimulus only, with the goal more aimed at stabilization rather than reacceleration at any cost. That there isn't a flood the market with stimulus just to reaccelerate, that there's still a longer-term transition in the economy ongoing, and one that's not necessarily going to be disrupted at the risk of exacerbating long-term imbalances and long-term challenges for China's economy, as I mentioned. So that's probably the biggest thematic issue with China. And geopolitics probably is additive, that the role of U.S.-China relationships is additive to that broader question of how does China want to respond in an environment of weakening growth, even though, with these risks of worsening some of these long-term issues. So I think that's going to be the big thematic issue for China from a growth perspective. And what does that mean for the rest of the world? If China's not providing significant mass fiscal stimulus, does that mean that we're not going to have, that has important implications for manufacturing globally? It's important implications for economies that have high links to manufacturing. You think in Europe, you think of Germany, for example. It also has big implications for economies that not only export raw commodities, but specifically to China. And obviously that includes a lot of the regional economies in Asia, both emerging markets and some of the developed economies as well. So very interesting year ahead for China as we think about how their outlook intersects with the rest of the world, where it appears that we're going to see some further moderation.
Well, that's really interesting, Brian. So we have a few minutes left, and I always love closing with the impossible and unfair question for Scott, which is predicting the unknown unknowns. What are the black swans people aren't talking about enough? Is it whether it's geographical, is it something in Asia or the Indian subcontinent, Latin America, or is it landscapes of conflict, cyber, physical, economic? Away from the things that we know to worry about, which are plenty, what do you worry about that maybe the rest of us aren't thinking about?
Well, listen, I will come on to the unknown unknowns, but the known, one of the known unknowns we should mention. We can't really wrap up a session on China without talking about Taiwan. It's a problem that could be the crucible for all of these nuances to suddenly disappear. And at the time of recording, we're recording when some of the biggest Chinese military exercises are taking place over and around the island. So these tensions are not going away. And the only point to just flag is early next year we have the Taiwanese election, and it seems to me that the crucial thing to look out for with that is the political messages that emerge from whoever wins that election, whether it's a hardline independence or a maintenance of the opaque understandings that there are around status of the island, in which case is a continuation of the status quo, which, by the way, includes these repeated moments of tension and intimidation. So I wanted to put that point in about Taiwanese election in January. In terms of the unknown unknowns, is tough, and sometimes I'm going to track back to two of the points we've already said. One is the global inspiring nature of the crisis in Gaza at the moment, and the effect that could have on Islamist terrorist transnational terrorist groups around the world. The situation in Afghanistan, for example, is pretty bad. Pakistan is receiving numerous attacks coming across its border with Afghanistan from groups in Afghanistan, and this is at a time as we lead into elections in South Asia. So we've got a Pakistan election due round about February if it takes place, or if it's not delayed again, and then we've got an Indian election next year as well. Now, the elections have often given an excuse for transnational terrorists to really optimize their leverage and their power and their profile. So I think we need to be just keep an eye on that environment and that opportunity for such actions, and again amplified because of what's been happening in Gaza, and that extends to other bits of the of South Asia. Bangladesh is wavering at time of recording. Bangladesh is going through a difficult period in terms of its electoral transition and moving into its own election, and that does not bode well for civil stability in Bangladesh. And I would also mention the Balkans. A potential sort of black swan moment could be if we see an eruption of violence between Serbia and Kosovo. Most probably, that tension hasn't gone away at time of writing. And then I think a truly unknown, John, I'll just drop it in here because it's something we came close to this year, is geopolitical confrontation driven by climate impact. And the case in point I'm thinking of is between Iran and Afghanistan, who came to blows, albeit at a fairly low level, but effectively over water supply. And I think that was an illustration of some of the tensions we will see in geopolitical areas that will be driven by water resources or arable land or the other impacts of climate change. So I think that could be something we'll see most likely to be seen in areas such as South Asia or in sub-Saharan Africa, where there's already a sense of instability after some of the coups of this year.
Thank you for that, Scott. And I think that's all we're going to have time for today. Thank you, Brian, also for joining us. And thanks to our guests for joining today and to our listeners and viewers for tuning in. Please make sure to follow us on social media to get more insights into the year ahead. And remember to click that like button so it's easier for others to find. We'll talk to you soon, I'm sure, in 2024 on these issues and many more.